Hello, I'm Donovan Bigelow, and this is the fourth hour of my lecture series on infant development. I realized at the end of the third hour that I had stopped the lecture right in the middle of what I think is one of the most important couple of paragraphs in child development literature that I've read. It actually is one of the best one or two paragraph summaries of the entire field, all condensed down into one. So I want to go back over that as a way to launch this fourth hour. This is from Closely Observed Infants, a text by Lisa Miller and her colleagues. This chapter is from Judith Shuttleworth. And she says, quote, "Just as the infant seems to experience internalization as a concrete process, so his screaming and kicking when distressed may be felt in fantasy as concrete attempts to split off and rid himself of his bad experiences. The presence of his mother, her mental activity and capacity for response, transforms this situation by providing a receptacle for these bad experiences, and so allowing the formation of a primitive process of communication." This is the idea of projective identification that we've talked about before. Through projective identification, the infant is brought into contact with his mother as a container, as an object with a space for the distress which he cannot tolerate, at the same time providing him with the opportunity for internalizing a mother who has this capacity. The fact that his mother's capacities allow her not simply to register the baby's distress, but to think about it consciously and unconsciously, and respond in a thoughtful way means that she is in a position to modify the demands made on the baby's psyche by distressing experiences, and at the same time give the baby his first contact with the human capacity for bearing pain through thinking. This model would imply that for the baby eventually to develop a structure within himself for dealing with his own distress, he requires a sufficient number of experiences of such a containing structure within another person. That's it. I think in the last 20 years, the shift in focus in infant development is contained in this large paragraph. The idea that a baby's mind develops not because what we teach it cognitively, not because of the external circumstances and the processes of feeding and diaper changing and what the bedroom looks like or what the house looks like, but what is going on in the most intimate level between the mother and the baby, between the baby and the family structure as a whole. What we have is the internalization of the mother's mind and her capacities. Shuttleworth goes on, "Through this contact with his mother's capacity for containment of mental states and their transformation into thought, the basis is laid for the development of these same capacities within the infant by means of internalization and identification, where the infant has had sufficient opportunity to communicate his experience through projective identification and to internalize his mother's capacity to tolerate and think about him. A new emotional resource grows within the infant around which his sense of himself can develop." This is the formation of an identity, a sense of self. It comes, if it comes, only through this process of internalization and identification with a healthy mother's mind at the affective level, not cognitive. The first 2 years of life, almost the first 3, the first 2 certainly. The communication of a baby and a mother is almost entirely emotional, affective. It is an attuned, emotionally connected resonance between the mother and the baby that provides everything the baby's nascent mind needs, internalizing all of these mother's capacities slowly and carefully over time. Around that internalization, the baby's self develops. This is a revolution in how we think about child and infant development. Before, it seems like the focus was almost entirely on externals. When did the baby sit up? When did the baby start taking food? When was it time for weaning? All of the external markers that you can find in almost any developmental psychology text concerning infant development, we see from the outside. And all those things are important, of course. We're not disparaging that at all, but what we're seeing is those are external indicators of the important process that's going on underneath. A sense of self based largely on identification with these internalized experiences makes possible a degree of tolerance of and openness to experience, both internally and externally. This forms the basis of a capacity to learn from the emotional impact of life. I think this is profound. I think this is the idea that our stance vis-a-vis the world, our sense of ourselves in the world, is almost entirely determined in the first 2 years of our life. To the extent, if this is true, to the extent this is true, we have opened up the possibility of profoundly transforming our focus on development. If it's true that my sense of self in the world, if I'm curious, if I want to explore, if I'm confident that I have some mastery or control in the world, it turns out that may be nothing more than the quality of my maternal experience taken into me and then projected out into the world. I come to be comfortable with the world because first I've become comfortable with my own internal experience. If I see the world as a dangerous, hostile place, if I'm almost paranoid in anticipation of persecution and dangers, it appears through this material that what that really means is that I have not had sufficient internalization of a containing mother, and that my own internal experiences of persecution and fear and anxiety were not adequately contained, thought about, and I did not sufficiently create, by internalization, a capacity within myself to manage my own emotional experience, and therefore it becomes compartmented. It becomes split off. It becomes projected back out into the world, which is better than having it in myself, because that pain is then, at least in fantasy, projected out, but it's not an effective way to be in the world. Paranoia doesn't lead to effective adaptive behaviors in reality. We end up, if we don't have sufficient containing experience, we end up generating defenses against the internal experience of fear, anxiety, anger, rage, envy, all the painful emotions. But I think, and perhaps as profoundly, we don't have an experience of loving kindness, and we get to the point, if it's too bad, that we're not even sure that exists. We are suspicious of it. We may profoundly need it. The lack of it may hurt us, but it makes it almost impossible to trust other relationships if our fundamental relationship was inadequate and the experience we took away from that was one of pain. This is some of the most profound, I think, revolutionary material I've ever read. A baby without sufficient containing experiences of a present healthy mother ends up mistaking its feelings for facts. Instead of being able to internalize an experience of thinking about feelings in a very real way, we end up with concrete thinking, which isn't really thinking at all if you think about it for a minute. Let's say I'm angry. Well, in a concrete way, it must be because you're doing something wrong to me, and I hate you for it. If I'm angry, an internalized sense of self that can think, really think, is able to interject in between that feeling and an acting out behavior a question or two. Why am I feeling this way? Is it because I'm in danger and this person is doing something bad to me I need to respond to in a defensive, reasonable, reality-based way? Or is something being evoked in me from my childhood in the transference? This person is doing something that I've had done to me before, and I am having a bunch of emotion that has long been repressed into the unconscious, evoked in this situation, which, if I allow it to continue, is not going to result in any kind of effective adaptive behavior. That is thinking. And so the capacity to think, the capacity, maybe better put, the capacity to feel and to recognize feelings as feelings, to recognize thoughts as my thoughts, to be able to detach them from a projected process where we see our feelings being concretely and immediately caused by external forces when they are not, at least not always, frankly, rarely. It appears Freud was right when he said psychic reality is more powerful than external reality. And it took me the longest time to understand what that meant until I started working with people with various addictions, until I see people behaving in ways that are so destructive, so repeatedly. Why do they do that? Because their internal experience of pain, their defenses against anxiety of a very primitive nature. And when I say primitive, I mean this infantile birth, perhaps even prenatal anxiety through at least 2, possibly 3 years, that being evoked in the context of their adolescent or adult experiences. When that happens, then we have this sense of feelings becoming projected facts and maladaptive behavior. All of the current 5 or 6 infant development paradigms, developmental psychology, attachment theory, psychoanalytic, infant observation, the neuropsychoanalysis, the neurodevelopmental revolution, all of these things are pointing in the same direction. And it seems to be that some developmental failure between the baby and the mother's inability to provide that containing environment, is the source of literally every adolescent and adult mental illness later in life. This opens up the possibility of prevention in a way it never has been before. If we can recognize this, we have the ability to see the difference between the content of an argument and the process of its experience internally. Now, that may sound a little theoretical, but I assume almost everyone at some point has gotten into an argument with a friend or spouse or partner, and one or the both of you realized that the intensity of the argument didn't match the thing you were arguing about, and people were overreacting. Well, that can only mean there's some unconscious dynamic in play that's juicing the apparent conflict, when what's really going on is primitive emotional dynamics of a very intense nature, uncontained, but now being evoked in the transference, leading to very unpleasant results most of the time. We have to be able to see the difference between the thing and the meaning of the thing. I've used that phrase before, but my sense is that this is what the internalized capacities of the mother does for the baby, to be able to hold its own experience as its own experience and to differentiate inside from outside. One of the, I think, deep understandings for the last 50 years in clinicians who work with schizophrenics is that their fragmented minds, uncontained, at the most primitive level, simply can't tell the difference between an internal delusion or hallucination and the external world. And internalizing the mother's capacity for thought and containment consolidates the infant's sense of self as it grows through the 2nd and 3rd year to what Margaret Mahler called object constancy, and that's an integrated sense of self. The schizophrenic has none of that, or very little, and remains fragmented. Once we see that it is this process of containment that allows the sense of self to be integrated, to be whole, to maintain a coherent sense of its identity vis-a-vis the world, we can also see that when that goes wrong, the derivatives of that are almost always going to be some form of mental illness. If maternal deprivation generates too large a difference between internal and external reality, the power of psychic reality will generate maladaptive behavior. Freud was right. Internal or psychic reality is more powerful than external reality. And the conclusion is there must be more internalized love than hate. If you take in enough love, and I go back to the old Native American saying, there are 2 wolves inside of every man's heart, love and hate. Which one wins? And the answer is the one you feed the most. And I think that's what this is getting at. There must be more internalized love than hate. And one of the uncomfortable conclusions in infant development, and I think any honest look at any baby will prove this beyond any doubt at all, is that babies are filled with extreme emotions. They love passionately and intensely and in an all-consuming way. And they are afraid at levels of terror, and they hate with a rage and are angry with terrible intentions at some level. And so they have all these intense feelings with them, and it is the mother's capacity to contain all of this that allows the self to cohere around it. So Shuttleworth concludes, for the newborn, only the actual presence of his mother can provide the continuity, attention, and sensuous pleasure needed to call up the infant's rudimentary capacity to integrate his perceptions and set in motion the process of mental development. His mother's attention to him will have enabled him to develop a capacity to attend to what is going on and to be increasingly curious about it. This is so important. The ability to be curious is not just a natural tendency of the human, though it is. It is an achievement in many serious ways. To be able to be curious implies enough strength, enough containment, enough confidence in the world to be able to feel safe enough, to feel enough trust that you can move through the world without damage. From his experience of being thought about by his mother, he will have become able to begin to reflect on his own experience. The legacy of his pleasure in being cared for seems to be found in his expectation of and capacity for enjoyment in an increasing range of relationships and activities which he is able to invest with meaning. Again, my stance toward the world is overwhelmingly determined by how much love and care I took in the first 2 or 3 years of my life. We do not have political beliefs based on some objective cost-benefit analysis of the world's situations. This has direct implications for how we see ourselves and others in the world. What I find is that anyone I've ever met who calls himself an activist in any capacity, doesn't matter what it is, seems to be projecting their own self-hatred in a very damaging way. I had a colleague of mine joke that anyone who calls themselves an activist could all be put in the same mental illness category. Now that's a little much, but the idea seems clear from this reading that our stance toward the world is really much more a function of our inner experience of self projected out onto the world. If we don't have enough love, we tend to split off and project those bad parts of ourselves, the parts that the mother would not or could not contain. And it is that process that derails the formation of a healthy self. It is that process that seems to be the core of virtually all mental illness. So to come at this from a different perspective, Judith Matrani is one of my favorite psychoanalysts. She wrote a book called Taking the Transference. And I think in about one paragraph, she does also just a fabulous job of summarizing the entire process of infant and child development. She characterizes it this way, slightly different than Shuttleworth, but you'll see these folks coming from different angles slightly, but I still think they're describing a very similar process. Perhaps looking at it from different perspectives will make it more clear. Okay, she talks also about projective and introjective identification. The mother's state of mind, most of all her capacity to deal with her own as well as her infant's anxieties, is the fulcrum upon which the baby's security and thus his mental health pivots. She adds something here. In order for the mother to contain the baby's anxieties, which is the necessary prerequisite for the growth of a healthy self, the mother has to first be able to contain her own. And this is obvious if you've ever been on an airplane with mothers and babies, or fathers and babies for that matter. The directions are always the same. Mothers, fathers, put the mask on yourself if there's a depressurization before you help your babies. Why? Well, it's obvious. A passed out mother or father isn't much good to the babies. I think Matrani is saying exactly the same thing. A mentally ill mother is not capable of sufficiently containing the baby's nascent self, containing the anxieties, the fears, the intense emotions, and therefore it is the mother's own ability to contain herself first that provides the only opportunity for her then to be able. Now, let's talk about Matrani's approach to thinking about this. She describes Bion's idea of reverie. Now, there's a lot of different names for the same thing. Reverie seems to work really well for me. I like the way it captures this sort of spirit. So she says, in Bion's model, the mother, in a state of what Bion called reverie, first receives or takes in those unbearable aspects of self, objects, affects, and unprocessed sensory experience of her infant that have been projected into her in fantasy. That sounds really technical, but it's just empathy. It's just every mother knowing full well that their baby is distressed and feeling that. If you can empathically be attuned with another, then everyone, I think, knows as a matter of common sense that pain shared is pain reduced. You know from your experiences with others that if someone comes to you and they're all distressed and you listen carefully and you take it in and you feel their distress and you help them with it by mainly being there and being understanding, then they go away feeling relieved. Well, that's just the adult way that mothers and babies interact at a level of unconscious resonance. There's nothing magical here. There's nothing particularly theoretically complex or abstract. This sounds, if you get away from a little bit of the jargon, just absolute common sense, everyday experience that we've all had from the beginning. Okay, so first there's reverie. Now, what reverie? The mother sits open to experience. The mother's mind is calm, not placid, but curious, accepting, able to be present in a containing way, able to take in the feeling states of the babies. Paying attention. Reverie is very much similar, I think, to Freud's idea of evenly hovering attention, which therapists are supposed to practice in front of their patients. The mother looks at the baby's body. The mother feels the baby's projected feelings. The mother's aware of the eyes, of the sound, of the touch of the baby. All of that together. And everything that goes into all of that seems to me to capture the idea of a reverie. Okay, what happens then? First is reverie. Second, she must bear the full effect of these projections upon her mind and body for as long as need be in order to be able to think about and to understand them. She takes them in this reverie. She takes in all the baby's pain, all the frustration, the kicking, screaming baby, and the mother takes all of that distress in. And what does she do with it? What she can't do is simply act it out in some other way or project it onto the father, or certainly not project it back into the baby. She's got to be able to feel it, really feel it, sit in it, take her time with it, experience it at the depths of her own soul. If she can do that, she then may be able to think about it in an honest way. Can she not only feel and think about her own feelings, having contained those, can she do exactly the same thing with the baby's feelings, to be able to hold them long enough to understand them, to immerse herself in them, to be aware of them? As long as that takes, and as difficult as it is, this is not an instantaneous, quick process. I think that's the nuanced addition here with Matrani. She's talking about a process that takes whatever time it takes. And some mothers may be quicker at it than others, but the idea in reverie is to simply be there, to do what needs to be done internally for as long as it takes to make the baby's experience in that moment tolerable, and not just tolerable, but through the interaction with the mother's mind, evoking growth in the baby. Not just soothing the distress. That's only part of it, but actually internalizing the mother's process of thoughtful containment. Okay, third, next, having thus transformed her baby's experiences in her own mind, she must gradually return them to the infant, detoxified in a detoxified and digestible form, and at such time as these may be of use to him, as demonstrated in her attitude and the way in which she handles him. So again, what does she give back? Is the mother herself frustrated and angry at this crying baby who won't be still, won't be soothed? What is the mother giving back? If it isn't peace and love and containment and kindness and joy, if it is frustration and anger and hostility and resentment, then the baby's in a great deal of trouble, and so is the mother, frankly. To conclude, the ability to contain, and this is the key, the ability to contain assumes a mother who has boundaries and sufficient internal space to accommodate her own anxieties as well as those acquired in relation to her infant. A mother who has a well-developed capacity to bear pain, to contemplate, to think, and to convey what she thinks in a way that is meaningful to her infant. A mother who is herself separate, intact, receptive, capable of reverie, and appropriately giving, is thus suitable for introjection as a containing object, and little by little over time, the infant's identification with and assimilation of such an object leads to increasing mental space, the development of a capacity to make meaning, and the ongoing evolution of a mind that can think for itself. Never read a better summary of what's necessary for infant development, and it rotates around the mother's quality of mind every time. Okay, I would like to move now to Renee Spitz's great book called The First Year of Life. Okay, so what does a secure mother do? All those things we've just been talking about. But we've all seen mothers who do things differently. Let's think about how variations on this theme can be a problem. First of all, Spitz talks about the emotional climate. Now, I don't know if you've seen my previous lectures on child development. There is an hour on a woman named Ella Freeman Sharp and her lectures on child development and her writings on child development, and she talks about the emotional atmosphere. Spitz talks about the emotional climate of the home. I think they're talking about exactly the same thing. And what Spitz says is what creates this climate, which he and Sharp and most of the thinkers in the current milieu of infant development, most people believe that the emotional atmosphere, the emotional climate in the home, which ultimately is a creation, is the result of the parents' collective minds. What creates this climate are the mother's feelings toward the child. Her love and affection for her child makes him an object of endless interest for her, and out of this unflagging interest she offers him an ever-renewed, rich and varied gamut, a whole world of vital experiences. What makes these experiences so important for the child is the fact that they are interwoven, enriched and colored by the mother's affect. What I said before, that the first 2+ years of life are all about an emotionally attuned, affective resonance. It isn't about language, it isn't about thought, it isn't about any external concrete experience, it isn't about values or belief systems or anything remotely like that. The entire developmental process is around the affective attunement of the mother and the infant. And to this affect, the child responds affectively. This is essential in infancy, for at this age, affects are of vastly greater importance than at any time later in life. During his first few months, affective perception and affects predominate in the infant's experience, practically to the exclusion of all other modes of perception. I think that is absolutely true. Therefore, the mother's emotional attitude, her affects, will serve to orient the infant's affects and confer the quality of life on the infant's experience. Hold on to that sentence. The mother's emotional attitude, her own affects, her own emotional experience, will serve to orient the infant's affects and confer the quality of life on the infant's experience. This is, I think, where the idea came from, that it is the mother who gives a self to the child. And I think that's almost a literal formulation. It isn't just guiding the child who exists already. The self of the child is a creation of the affective attunement of the mother. If she is healthy, if the child can take in that containing capacity, there is not just a self, but a quality of life that is transferred in that emotional atmosphere, in that emotional climate of the mother's containment. Please remember that I think I mentioned in one of the first sessions on infant development that video called The Still Face Experiment by Dr. Tronick. Go back and take a look at that again. This, I think, that video perfectly illustrates Renee Spitz's point here, that it is the emotional attunement of the mother that provides the child everything it needs affectively. And when that's taken away, the child is almost instantly distressed. How might that happen, sadly? Well, a couple of styles that we should be aware of. Spitz talks about the permissive mother. What does that mean exactly? Well, I think in our modern society, we want to be permissive. We want to let the child grow up. Let the child be whoever it is. Let them be free. The problem is that's not in the needs, that doesn't represent the needs of the growing infant's mind. Permissive, when it's pathological, is a kind of boundarylessness. And what does that sound like? A complete lack of a container. In order for the child's mind to grow, these feeling states must be contained. That means boundaries. That means limitations. A neurotic permissiveness is not in the child's needs. And we've all seen parents who can't say no, who let the children do whatever they want in a kind of reaction, perhaps, to the parent's own experience of harsh or judgmental or authoritarian parents, and they're not going to do that with their kids. They swing to the other extreme, and that often is just as damaging in some very direct and painful ways. Spitz talks about the rejecting or hostile mother. Again, depending on that mother's own developmental experience, internalized experiences of hostility, frustration, anger will be evoked when the baby's needs are so great that the mother cannot tolerate them. And what's then evoked in the mother is hostility, a rejecting attitude. She can't handle it, doesn't want to at some level, and the dynamic between the child and the mother at that point goes very, very awry. There's another example that Spitz has of the anxious mother. This is the mother who's neurotically activated, hypervigilant, always hovering. I've heard the phrase helicopter mother, always hovering around. But what is the baby experiencing? The baby is experiencing taking in the mother's mind, which is drenched in anxiety. Is the mother taking in the baby's anxiety? No, the baby is being drenched by the mother's anxiety. It can't handle its own anxiety. It certainly can't handle its own and its mother's simultaneously. And that generates a kind of false self. Winnicott calls that an impingement on the baby that requires the baby to defend itself against that impingement by erecting a defensive false self. This derails development rather dramatically. We'll see something similar when we get to a discussion of the autistic spectrum. It is obvious that the mother's issues will reverberate in the infant's behavior, leading under certain conditions to an escalation of conflicts. And again, and I think more importantly, the infant takes in the mother literally, and therefore, if the mother's mind isn't sufficiently contained, she cannot contain the baby. And I've heard, and I've had people tell me, well, wait a minute, there's more people in the baby's life than just the mother. And what Spitz suggests is, of course, that's obviously true. The problem is all the baby's experiences with others are transmitted through the mother, through the baby's relationship with the mother. That is the template, that is the filter through which the baby takes in all experiences. And therefore, a containing experience in others, though helpful, will not mitigate the fundamental failure of a mother to represent to have a contained mind herself. This is the core of it. Yes, there should be several layers of containment around the mother, primarily the father. We'll get to that as well a little bit later. But without the mother's ability to do this, then everything goes awry almost regardless of what else is going on in the baby's life. The existence of the mother, her mere presence, acts as a stimulus for the responses of the infant. Her least action, be it ever so insignificant, even when it is not related to the infant, acts as a stimulus. Success increases his pleasure, and he will repeat and ultimately master success-specific behavior. On the other hand, he will abandon actions which regularly lead to failure. The problem is, it isn't failure or success objectively. It is failure or success in evoking a loving response from the mother. If a child is doing something that developmentally is good for the child and the mother meets it with resistance, rejection, anger, hostility, permissiveness, or rejection, the baby will stop doing it to their own detriment. It is that resonance with the mother, the guidance the baby inevitably takes based on the affective attunement of the mother or not, that will determine the baby's developmental trajectory. If her attitude is maternal and tender, she enjoys practically all of her baby's activities. Her affects, her pleasure, her own actions, conscious or unconscious, facilitate innumerable and varied actions of her baby. I believe that the largest measure of facilitation for the infant's actions is provided not by the mother's conscious actions, but rather by her unconscious attitudes. And I think this is the most important idea. Everyone knows the old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think everybody understands what that means. Well, it turns out in parenting, the exact same thing is just as valid. My desire to be a good father, a mother's desire to be a good mother, is almost irrelevant. Their intentions, if not backed up by an unconscious, solid sense of identity and self, that can be as much the unconscious container, the natural receptacle, the automatic attunement to the baby's emotional experience. If that isn't present in the unconscious of the parent, no amount of external cognitive behaviors designed to take care of the infant's external circumstances is going to substitute for affective containment. This is, I think, the core of the revolution in infant development thinking over the last 20 years. One more, I think, a really important point. Spitz downplays the role of specific trauma. And I think there may be, I've been saying many times that the field of infant development in all its various iterations is virtually unified, and I think that's true. This is one area where there's still a little disagreement. Spitz says, I cannot emphasize sufficiently how small a role traumatic events play in this development. What we see again and again are the cumulative results of iterative experiences and stimuli, of endlessly repeated sequences of responses. The same principle of cumulation holds for the etiology of possible later neurosis. Isolated traumatic events rarely play a decisive role in bringing about neurosis. Now, I think he would agree that if the trauma is catastrophic, it is if it's severe, ongoing abuse at some PTSD-generating level, then I think everyone understands that trauma generates dissociation, trauma generates derailed personality development, severe abiding trauma generates borderline personality disorder, and many other serious personality disorders at the very least. That's true. But I think what Spitz is saying here is that for the vast majority of children, there aren't those kinds of traumas, and that if there is a problem, it is a reflection of the atmosphere in the home and the derailment of the parents' minds from the capacity to be that container. Obviously, if there's some trauma, it has to be looked at. But I think Spitz and before him, Ella Freeman Sharp are onto something when they're telling therapists, don't look for individual trauma. What is the mental state of the parents? What is the loving atmosphere in the home like? Is it loving? It's always going to be a mix. What is that mix made of? Don't hone in on trying to tie some adolescent or adult pathology. Don't try to track down the trauma, the abuse, the accident, the injury. That is not going to be, in most cases, a productive way of getting at the source of the trauma. This point, to the extent it's valid, ought to reorient therapists in a pretty dramatic way. I think as a field, we have inevitably, in the last 100 years, I mean, this is how Freud taught us originally, to look for the trauma that derailed therapy. It turns out most of the time there isn't one. And I think I think we have bounced back and forth in my field for literally over 100 years, looking for the trauma that caused the neurosis, and now perhaps we can find a little balance. Significant trauma, establishing an abusive atmosphere in the home will of course generate pathology, obviously. But if there isn't that kind of trauma, we have to look for the emotional atmosphere of the parents. I think that's a perfectly reasonable balance to be struck here. I'm going to go back to one thing that Spitz said. And he quotes Freud here. It's a little bit technical, but I think it's worth spending a couple of minutes on. A sentence of Freud's follows here, which in a monumental condensation unfolds a whole sector of psychoanalytic thought. Quoting Freud, "This path of discharge thus acquires an extremely important secondary function, that of bringing about an understanding with other people, and the original helplessness of human beings is thus the primal source of all moral motives." I think what that means is what I said before. Feelings aren't facts. Belief systems flow from character structure. You believe things about the world not because you've done a cost-benefit analysis, but because of the nature of your affective attunement with your mothering figure from birth to 2 months and prenatally as well. I don't think there's any doubt about that anymore. But I think that opens up an opportunity to relax about political differences and see them first and foremost as projections of your own psychic reality. It ought to save us from ridiculous, pointless arguments over politics. That's a content question. What about the process in each of us? Before we can argue something about a political policy in reality, we have to know how our position on that was evoked and transformed and determined, in fact, not by reality, but by our internalization of our mother's capacity for thought, or the lack thereof. Just astonishing. So, what is... I've bounced back and forth between what's good and what's not good. Let's summarize, let's follow Spitz in his summary of what normalcy is. We're always talking about psychopathology, and we like to throw words around like neurosis and borderline personality disorder, and it helps us feel like we know stuff when perhaps we don't. But we don't get around very often to talking about what's normal, and I think Spitz nails it here. Let us begin by saying that a normal child is a healthy-looking, active individual who on the whole gives the impression of being happy, and who gives his parents little to worry about. He eats well, he sleeps well, he grows well. His weight increases regularly, as does his size, and month by month he becomes brighter and more active, more and more of a human being. Emotionally, he enjoys his parents and his surround more and more, and vice versa. He is being increasingly enjoyed by them. I don't think I've ever read a paragraph that more beautifully summarizes what healthy, what normal, what loving means when we look at a family with a young child. I want to add here, and I'm going to come back to this again a bit later, the complete dependency of the baby makes for a complete responsibility on the part of the parents. So much sensitivity in the infants require parents to be aware of their own infantile sensitivities and contain them. I think that paragraph nicely points where we must look, and that's the responsibility of the parents to get their own houses in order before turning to external behavioral, cognitive ways of child rearing. The complete dependency of the baby makes for a complete responsibility on the part of the parents. So let me go back and look at reverie again. An analyst, a child analyst named Jeff Eaton, summarized reverie this way once. Reverie can be described as the mother's capacity to register her infant's distress, reflect upon it, and respond to it. A mother capable of reverie meets this distress and all of her infant's nascent emotional states in a way that helps make her infant's experience not only more tolerable, but also potentially meaningful. And that's what I mean when the infant, with that experience under their belt sufficiently, is able then to be happy the way Spitz described, is able, I think because of that, to begin that fascinating exploration of the world, that curiosity, insatiable curiosity on the baby's part, wants to get into everything, and that is a good thing because that means they are safe. They are not content, but contained. They are secure. They feel a sense of almost existential trust that the world is a place fascinating and worthy of discovery. If they don't have that, they are inevitably in a position where anxiety is the dominating emotional effect, and the world appears to be a very dangerous place. Okay, let's shift focus again. I think it's appropriate for just a little bit to reiterate some of the material from David Scharf's great book, The Sexual Relationship. And it's important because I think he, and there's several lectures on this website about the sexual relationship and sexual development from infancy on. And I think to summarize briefly, the idea is simply this, that sexuality and identity are two sides of the same coin, that we cannot separate our sexuality from the very core of who we are. Our personality is inextricably linked, convoluted, interacting elements of our sexuality. Patients always misunderstand this. People misunderstand this. They think they have themselves, and they describe a sex life. I have a sex life. No, you don't. You are your sex life. You cannot separate your identity from your sexuality. The reason that's important here is because identity begins to be formed at the prenatal level and certainly postnatally, and therefore sexuality and its development begins simultaneously with that development, no separating it out. And this allows us in a very direct way, and I think in some ways a very disturbing way, to look at adult sexuality and see in it the core of this development that I've been speaking about, and how it has manifested itself. Because if the parental sexuality is dysfunctional, that means the self is dysfunctional, and that means the baby's in trouble. We have to look at, and I think Scharf's one of the most powerful quotes I've ever read, and this was very disturbing, is that the sex life of the parents is therefore closely related to the adequacy of the nurturing environment given to the child and adolescent. The ways in which this is true are often startlingly direct. Well, if you accept the idea that the atmosphere in the home, the mind of the parents, is what the child takes in as the core of their own identity, and if it now seems simply obviously true that our sexuality is interwoven with our identity, then you come to the unpleasant, sometimes startling even, scary, but necessary conclusion that if parents themselves don't have a healthy, nurturing, good enough, adequately soothing and enjoyable sex life, then they probably aren't being good enough parents. I don't think this is an escapable conclusion from this material. And I challenge parents to take a healthy inventory of their own stance towards sexuality. Do they have a healthy, mostly satisfying, reasonable sexuality? If they don't, how are their infant, baby, children, toddlers, how and what are they taking in as part of their psychosexual development? We have to be courageous enough to recognize, as difficult as it is to even talk about, that if the mother's mind and the father's is being taken in virtually in toto by the infant, if the sexual dysfunction of the parents is also being taken in by the baby because of that, then we are setting our children up for a lifetime of sexual dysfunction if we don't clean up our own act first. And that is so tremendously, I think, distressful for most parents. But if it's true, or to the extent it is true, to pretend it isn't is doom. To pretend it isn't is just a guarantee that you cannot adequately parent your children to healthy adolescence and adulthood. I just don't see any way around that. So Scharf ends, I think, this section with a very powerful paragraph. We can therefore draw on the whole process of separation individuation in attempting to understand why some couples cling together symbiotically. Some use deviant methods, e.g. sadomasochistic, to force a separation they cannot otherwise tolerate, while others go back and forth in what seems to be an endless reliving of rapprochement, as though they either cannot remain individuals if the spouse gets too close or takes over, or if they cannot let go for fear of loss of the object and of themselves as well. Much of the process of defense can be understood around the anxieties of the failure to make a secure attachment and the fears of separation from and loss of the attachment figure. And this is the key. Later in life, when defenses interfere with sexual life, they will also be speaking for these early anxieties concerning loss of the love object. And so we see here now the opposite end of the spectrum. We've been talking about the parent's effect on the child's development. But what Scharf is talking about is that development's effect on the adult experience and the adult's absolute responsibility to find the courage, to find the help, to recognize that that's what's going on, so that what is being translated to, projected onto, identified with by the child will be as good and hopefully good enough mind, hopefully good enough mind to allow the child to take in a healthy, loving stance toward the world. Okay. Let me move on from that a bit toward the question, the more specific question of the role of fathers. And I'm going to come back to this from a couple of different angles. Again, Jeff Eaton, a child analyst here in the Northwest, described the continuing function of the couple is expanded through their creative cooperative relationship. In this model, the maternal function as a projective identification welcoming object, okay, that's a little much. What he's shifting here is away from just a discussion of the mother's impact on the child to panning back a little and seeing how the father impacts both of them as a system of mutual impact. If the mother is something that can take in the child's projection and welcome it, that's all that means, and transforms the baby's pain through reverie. While the maternal function reflects compassion for the baby, the paternal function contributes discipline to the transformational process with the setting of limits. Compassion is the ability to tolerate suffering while also actively investigating it in order to lessen it and to learn from it. Discipline is the willingness to frustrate and set limits even if it causes pain and arises out of the spirit of protection and love. I think we have almost an archetype, male and female roles, which are generated by natural, genetic, gender differences based on biology, that we have a natural order of things, a container and a contained, but also the male figure functioning as a container for the containing mother. We have layers of containment when it works right, and the function of the father here is in addition to, not a substitute for, and not something that can be substituted. It matters. The mother's function is irreplaceable. Someone has to function as a mother, or the babies fail to thrive. They die without a mothering person to contain their developmental needs. But I think there's a fair argument that the father is just as irreplaceable as the mother, for two reasons. One, there is a separate developmental need the baby has for a fathering figure's presence and the difference that that makes to the baby in what's evoked developmentally in terms of the baby's needs. And also, and just as important, maybe more important, is that the mother who is in a reverie, a mother who experiences what Winnicott called primary maternal preoccupation, cannot do that without support. And it's hard to imagine someone more motivated to support that dynamic than a healthy father who is present to the child's needs and present to the mother's needs in terms of the development of reverie. I would add one point to that, however, that adult development, the development of our identities as men, seem to require, and this is disputed, there's some disagreement about this, but I think at least there's an argument to be made that a profoundly important developmental accomplishment of adult men is being a present and good and loving and caring and containing father. Men who are fathers and have done so in a way like I'm describing here have achieved something in their life unique. Those that haven't done that, for whatever reason, are missing something about the experience of humanity. And I think they can do that and choose to do that in our modern society if they so wish, and their lives may be full and rich in spite of that. But there's something that is a genetic predisposition. There's something that is a genetic, profoundly, I think, biological push to mothering, which we all know about, the alarm clock going off in some women's 30s. But I'm going to argue that men and women are not that different in this, that men, though it may be layered underneath cultural prejudice, if you will, that there is still something about a man's job as father that is, ought to be, can be, a profoundly developmental experience for the man himself. Now, Kaplan also wrote a fair amount about the role of fathers here, and I think it's true that sharing hope in a family dynamic, sharing hope for a child, sharing hope for the loving relationship, deepens the bonds of love between a husband and a wife, a mother and a father. I think there are some natural tensions, and I think both of these things can be true. That there's, it seems to me quite common for expectant fathers to feel a little bit of resentment around the mother's primary maternal occupation and the fairly intense focusing of her attention on the upcoming child, and after the birth, of course, for several months, on the child almost exclusively, certainly to the exclusion of the husband's needs to a significant degree. That does sometimes generate some resentments. That is up to the father to contain, because he must see the primary importance of what the mother is doing. And she is giving up a lot to focus on the infant's needs. He must give up a lot to ensure the mother can experience primary maternal preoccupation, a reverie in the context of containing the baby. And everybody sacrifices, fathers no less, and to act out on a resentment is a sign of neurotic problems. I think there's some legitimacy to the frustration that men have that our traditional role, which has always revolved around providing and protecting, seems to have been supplanted in a modern society by the welfare state and 911. We are no longer, at least externally, as profoundly necessary as we used to be in a less affluent society. But we could argue, and I will argue, that nothing has changed in terms of the emotional needs of a mother and a baby, that a man's role is now as much to provide and protect the mother's containing reverie. And I think that remains a profoundly appropriate and necessary role for any father. There is perhaps a traditional excessive independence in masculine old school ways of being, that we were too disconnected from our families. I think the problem now is that there may be an excessive dependence on relational figures. We used to be too distant. Now we seem to be dysfunctional in some way. The idea here is trying to generate a fathering function that is beyond infantile dependence, but accepting of a mature dependence. We have such a thing as mature dependence. And I think that the father's role is to try to carve out, while the mother is carving out her role vis-a-vis the child as a container, the father must also figure out how he functions in this dynamic in the context of cultures that are pulling us hither and yon. So let's take a short break at this point, and we'll move on to the second and final hour. Thank you.